Disco Elysium Mobile is here. The fan-favorite RPG is regarded as a modern classic and still stands as the highest-rated PC game of all time. However, when Studio Zaum published the trailer for the mobile port, the news were met with suspicion, to say the least. In fact, the fan community had an absolute field day, producing an abundance of memes, all poking fun at the prospect of getting served horrible mobile slop from a studio that had already fallen out of its fans' favor. Meanwhile, it certainly didn't help that Zaum promoted their game as something that is supposed to appeal to consumers of short-form content and quote-unquote captivate the TikTok user. But is the game really that bad? In this video I want to give it a fair review, and while I will voice a fair amount of critique of the game, you might just be surprised about a few things it does right. Let's start with the basics. First of all, Disco Elysium Mobile does not just squeeze the original game and its UI onto a small vertical screen. Instead, it came up with a number of solutions about how to translate Disco Elysium from a classic CRPG experience to a handheld one. And while I will go through the details of these solutions in the following chapters, you might have already noticed the most prominent feature of the port, which is the extensive new artwork through which you now interact with the city and its inhabitants. Instead of adopting the map of the original game, the art team went through the effort of repainting the entirety of Martinez from hundreds of new angles. Within each of these new scenes you can swipe to look around, sometimes in 360-degree panoramas, and interact with characters and items. Every NPC encounter now has its dedicated scene too, replacing their portrait from the original game. But more about that in the art section of this video. This new style is still accompanied by the game's original full voice acting,
Hello, I'm Kim Kitsuragi,
as well as the full soundtrack by C-Power. When we're discussing mobile ports of PC and console games, one concern that always comes up revolves around the sacrifices that have to be made to trim down the original game to a downscaled version of itself, both graphically and in regards to its gameplay systems. And since Disco Elysium Mobile was supposed to be easily digestible by a more casual audience, I assumed they would do it like in the Game Boy remake where, for example, they reduced the game's 24 skills to 4 main attributes. But to my surprise, all the systems and mechanics are still here with the same complexity as in the original game. The inventory remained, containing everything from clothes to drugs and valuables. You can still internalize thoughts in the thought cabinet, and the 24 skills are all still present. You now even get a few extras in the form of a case file that evolves with your playthrough, containing all the information you collect about the murder case and the characters you meet throughout the game. What I personally worried about the most when I saw Disco Mobile being announced was the possibility of Zaum cutting not systems but content from the game. They might after all prefer a politically more sanitized game that this time might not get immediately banned upon its release. Disco Elysium after all is not a game that walks on eggshells. Fortunately, however, after playing through the whole game and cross-checking a few of the more edgy dialogue choices, it seems they remained faithful to the original in this aspect as far as I could tell. You can still be the most racist person alive or a bloodthirsty Stalinist.
Oh yeah, get the firing squads and the animal wagons ready.
And you can still take speed on the job and shoot the gremlin kid in the face. That is, if you pass the skill check. However, although the game doesn't exactly censor anything, it does introduce another type of cut content through its more streamlined approach to story progression, which for me is the most significant concern I have with the game. But we will get to that in a second, because while we're going through initial concerns, let's quickly talk about monetization. First of all, there are no microtransactions in the game, and we did also not in fact get Gacha Elysium. Instead, the monetization model consists of a free-to-play start into the first levels of the game, followed by a $10 payment to unlock the rest of it. I personally think that's a very straightforward way to monetize a game, and that it's very fairly priced, maybe even a bit of an atonement price to appease the fanbase. Overall, I think it fits the low-threshold, high-accessibility approach they're following with the port, because now you can just tell people to quickly try it out with no financial commitment at all. As a very last point, before we have a look at how the game actually works, I want to place a short disclaimer. Most of the footage you will see was recorded from the preview version of the game that I, just like other reviewers, received from Zaum. However, the offer came with no strings attached, so I'm free to say whatever I want, and I will eventually take that opportunity to discuss the aspects of the game that I'm still highly skeptical about. Now, those of you who are familiar with my channel already know that I have strong opinions about the Studio Zaum and the events surrounding it. And after all, the studio affairs are the reason why the fans of the original game were immediately suspicious of a mobile game being produced by Zaum in its current form. However, at this point, many others and I have already extensively talked about the situation quite a number of times, so if you want to inform yourself about the studio affairs, all the relevant information is publicly available for you to form your own opinion. As for this video, I want to focus on the game itself, because I think it does deserve a fair review. And at the end of the day, the people who actually worked on it are not to blame for what happened on the CEO level. For the most part, Disco Elysium Mobile tries its best to preserve the content of the original game while reshaping the way and the order in which you interact with that content. When I mentioned levels earlier, you might have wondered what I was talking about, because they were certainly not in the original game. For Disco Elysium Mobile, however, they are the central organizing principle of your playthrough. The game progresses through 16 chapters, each containing a progression of levels, or how I called them before I knew the official vocabulary, scenes. In practice, what I earlier described as a more streamlined approach to story progression works like this. You choose the newest scene or level in the newest chapter and spawn into that scene, which contains the latest stage in the game's story progression. Once you spawned into the scene, you can have a good look around, click the little bubbles to get to know more about your environment, and interact with the outlined items and characters. A lot of the items now have dedicated artwork too that lets you zoom in on its details when you examine it. For example, in the original game, using the coin-operated viewers produces a bit of text describing the sea fortress that they're pointed at. The mobile port, however, actually shows you the view through the binoculars. Some scenes also have an imminent progression and extend while you're playing through them. Once you have fulfilled a scene's objective, which often involves obtaining a new lead in the main case, you can progress to the next one. This new linearity also means that you cannot go back to a previous scene after having played through it. So there is no open world aspect to the game anymore. Sometimes completing a scene leaves you with loose ends, basically side quests to complete at any later point, but for the most part, that's really the only thing you get to decide the sequence of. This, of course, offers a lot less freedom than the original game, where if you wanted, you could finish the game without even looking at the victim's body. And this is the aspect of the port that I'm still very much on the fence about. Because while Disco Elysium Mobile does its best to preserve its identity as a detective RPG, it becomes clear that this genre at its heart is not indifferent to how it's presented and interacted with, especially not the detective side of things. Because in Disco Mobile, you can't really stumble around the map anymore looking for clues while you chart your own course through the investigation. Sometimes in the mobile port I was stuck in a scene and couldn't exit until I exhausted each character's dialogue, when I would have preferred to not ask them every question possible and instead just follow another lead. Overall, this more linear and streamlined approach means that you as the player are less able to assume the role of a detective who has to actively think about what to do and where to go next. Instead of navigating through the game now navigates you through itself. Now, to be fair, this might of course be the preferred playstyle for mobile gamers who just want to progress through a bit of the game's story in a 10-minute window like in an audiobook. But I personally like the detective side of things, and I appreciate the trust that developers bestow on their players when they give them the agency to fail, to run into dead ends and be forced back to the drawing board. For me, a big appeal of the original game was to get lost in matinees, not knowing what to do and just pursuing side quests or listening to the stories of NPCs until I stumble across a new piece of evidence. I think that's how Harry would have done it, and it provided me with the immersion and agency that I looked for in an RPG. Here, the mobile game's approach might be user-friendly and foolproof to a fault. For example, in every scene, all interactable objects and characters are indicated with not only an outline, but also with little dots on the bottom of your screen that show you whether an object is still interactable or already exhausted. When you touch these dots, you can immediately zoom in on the objects and then directly swipe between them. So not only do you not have to look for clues, but you could effectively ignore the upper 90% of your screen when you're navigating a level. Now, having said all of that, the game does hand over a bit of decision-making back to you, when sometimes it lets you choose what part of the story you want to tackle next, or when you have the option to follow or ignore loose ends. And at the same time, let's not act as if the original game, especially towards its end, was particularly decision-driven. The last parts of the investigation will always play out in more or less the same way, independent of what path you choose on your way to it. Overall, the port leaves us with an interesting case study about how form and content in video games relate and can contradict each other. What really happens when you turn an open-world isometric CRPG into something more akin to a visual novel? Because one could easily argue that at the end of the day, the original game's overarching story, its writing, its world-building, characters and politics are still all there and remain mostly untouched. And sure, the forms in which these things are presented to us and through which we interact with them are not external to their content. But ultimately, it might be up to the players to decide what they consider to be the core of Disco Elysium and whether they believe that specific part to be sufficiently captured in the mobile port. Ultimately, I too have to remind myself that this is neither a replacement for the original Disco Elysium, nor does it take away anything from our experience with it. And since it's tailored to a different target group, there is no real competition between the mobile port and the original either. If anything, it could work as a gateway to the original game. When we're talking about the mobile-specific ways to access the world of Elysium, we have to talk about the game's UI. And to say it up front, it is a little disgusting how intuitive they made it. One of the biggest challenges for Disco Elysium's port, or any port really, was to redesign the original game's menus without losing any of its functionality, while at the same time not making the small phone screen feel cramped. And when I first navigated through the mobile port's dialogue menu, I understood what they meant when they alluded to short-form video platforms in their marketing pitch. The dialogue menu works by swiping to the left and right to choose between different options. I think that's a good solution compared to a big field of dialogue to reduce the amount of text on screen at any given time. To continue a conversation, you swipe up your chosen dialogue in the same way that you would swipe up a video on TikTok or YouTube Shorts to get to the next one. It's a motion that we've all grown accustomed to and that is, for the better or the worse, neuropsychologically associated with a small burst of excitement. You can also swipe down to see the dialogue history and click past dialogues to repeat voice lines.
Hello, sir. Step right in. The store is open.
This way of navigating through dialogue feels like a little mini-game and is overall very smooth and snappy. Skill checks too work by swiping up, which together with a slight vibration of your phone gives you the feeling of throwing your dice on the screen. Now, you might say that all of this is just behavioristic programming that manipulates you with minuscule amounts of good chemicals, and you would not be wrong. But if you watch the dev videos of the original game, then you might remember Robert Kurwitz talking about Twitter in the same way that the mobile game mentions TikTok. The original game's dialogue box took inspiration from the way Twitter works on phones. It's the reason why the text rolls upwards in a vertical field and gives you short bursts of text to read. Something that before Disco was far from being an established design. So in a way the mobile port simply went with the times once again and adapted the controls of the current most popular phone apps. And I must say that it does work. It's been a decade since I played any games on my phone, so I started out by projecting the game on my monitor and navigating the menus with my mouse. But even I got the hang of the swipe controls pretty much immediately after I actually tested them for a bit. If I had one critique of the UI, it's that they deviated from the overarching design idea of the original UI, which was based on analog media and media devices such as magnetic tapes, typewriters, and the tape computers that we find in the game itself. Instead, the game is now putting function over form. As for the rest of the UI, they tidied up the remaining menus so that they all fit into one unintrusive line on the top of your screen. In there you will find every panel of the original game, from your inventory to your thought cabinet and skill overview. They arguably improved on the clothes menu, which is now in classic RPG fashion divided by clothing slots. Besides that, the game also features little interactive elements from time to time where you manually wipe your mirror or bang on a door using touch controls. The big 360 panoramas offer you the option to switch from swipe controls to motion controls, which is a bit impractical but fun to play around with. Lastly, I think the sound designers have done a great job with the new soundscape that comes with the new UI functions. Overall, even though the game has a fair share of shortcomings, many of which I will go into in a bit, I don't think the UI is one of them. There is much to unpack when it comes to the art of the mobile port, but to put first things first, I think they have done a good job with the artwork, and I never thought they would go through the effort of recreating not only pretty much every corner of Martinez, but also every character and a large number of objects. There are some really nice artworks in the game too. When you emerge from the darkness of your room, Kim is waiting for you in the light of the well-lit entrance like a long-lost lover. The Frittte kiosk looks very cozy, and there's a great sense of lighting in the ravers tent as well as in the portraits of the ravers themselves. Overall, I don't feel like they've misrepresented anything or anyone from the original game. It looks all very much on point and how I imagined it would look like from outside of an isometric perspective. However, that is also why I cannot judge how well the new art fulfills its function of setting the stage of the game and orienting new players in it. I already know the original game, so I'm very familiar with the game's map and how the different scenes of the port are connected. When the game teleports me to, let's say, Roy's pawn shop, I know that it's a bit south of the plaza, just like the backyard with the hanged man is right next to the whirling. But I have no idea if someone who is new to the game would be able to sufficiently visualize matinees before their inner eyes and fill out the gaps like I do. So if you or a friend of yours ends up playing Disco Mobile first, please tell me how it is to experience matinees not through seamless exploration, but through semi-connected samples. As for orienting the players within individual scenes, sometimes the artwork of a place can be a little too rough to make out its details, but it usually makes up for that by letting you zoom in on the more relevant parts, like the different shelves in the bookstore or a mailbox that you can kick the shit out of. What surprised me was that Harry's clothes still change according to what you dress him in, and the game manages to shape them according to the scene he's in. Now, when I mentioned that the game's art looks generally good enough all around, that was an honest compliment. Yet at the same time it achieves this look by mimicking the now established art style that we can't call anything but the Disco Elysium aesthetic. Everywhere we now see the painterly visuals, the broad expressionist brushstrokes, and abstract splashes of color that we learn to appreciate from the original game's art. However, while in Disco Elysium the function of the more exaggerated, surrealist elements of its art was to break out of the grey world of Elysium, they now have made that art into a standardized style from which, ironically, nothing really breaks out from anymore. So while I think that the game's new art is both consistent and pleasing to the eye, I also think that it's just very uninteresting, because they reified a unique approach to art into an aesthetic among others that can now be applied on a mass basis to everything that needs to be depicted in the game. It makes the artwork a little generic and predictable, which, again, ironically, is the opposite of the eccentric style that it's trying to imitate. There is a reason why I dedicated a video to the portraits of Disco Elysium and why I don't feel any urge to repeat that for this game. You won't catch me contemplating the new artwork because there simply isn't much that causes you to reflect and no depth to feel out. Instead, it's mostly just surface with little going on below it. I saw this to be particularly evident in the updated archetype portraits. The old ones were one of Disco's finest artworks and imbued with thought and meaning. For the mobile port, they simply painted them over so that they seamlessly fit the rest of the game's aesthetic. Same with Harry's expression in the mirror. Disco Elysium's original art was vaguely expressionist in the simple sense that it expressed something about what it depicted beyond what could be portrayed in a more naturalistic way. It did so through abstract and sometimes surrealistic elements. But when this characteristic way of expression, which is always the expression of something, is standardized into a uniform style, it, of course, ceases to express anything. So when I see the disco aesthetic of abstract forms and colorful speckles of the original art return in the port's artwork, I don't expect them to mean anything. They're just there to be pretty, to establish a consistent aesthetic, and to avoid painting detailed backgrounds for hundreds of artworks. But besides the more abstract observations, I think what the mobile game's art missed out on the most was to truly utilize its new perspective to show us anything that we didn't see before in the isometric view of the original game. Because now, after my playthrough of the port, I've seen matinees from angles that we could never see in the original, yet the game didn't show me anything new, even though in the original game there was so much happening off-screen. They could have shown us the Coalition patrol ships that still swarm the sky and keep Revachol surveilled under colonial rule, or the visual interferences around the Pale anomaly, anything really. I think this might be the biggest missed opportunity of the mobile game, because it would actually give us something that we did not have in the original game. However, in the end it's not all doom and gloom. The art of Disco Elysium Mobile absolutely fulfills its function of giving you a stylized impression of its places and characters. The artwork looks well done all around, and there's no argument that can take that away from the game. I think it is obvious to everyone who played the game that there were talented artists working on this. I think the only character who looked a little off to me compared to the original game was Strand, but that too might just come down to personal opinion. After all, we only have a small rectangle and a low poly in-game model for comparison. The rest of the NPCs are all very well captured, and I have no complaints about them besides the more derivative nature of their artworks. At the end of the day, I can understand why they aim to reproduce the well-recognizable Disco Elysium aesthetic and simply went with what has proven to work instead of creating a new art style from scratch. And ultimately, since I've been mentally cherry-picking Disco's greatest artworks, let's also not forget that its character models looked like this. The crime, the suspects, the investigation, the revelations, all the elements critical to any work of detective fiction are all here, but newly designed for short play sessions that should easily fit into your life, said Chris Priestman, narrative lead for Disco Mobile. Just as a reader may settle into a novel or a TikTok user may scroll their feed, Disco Elysium for Android invites you into a character, story and world like no other, whenever or wherever you reach into your pocket for a quick escape from reality. That's the pitch that Priestman gave to the online news outlet Tech Times. Now, when I started playing Disco Mobile, I forgot just how massive the game was. My brain couldn't quite process the contradiction of playing a 30-hour in-depth RPG on a device that I never used for any game more complicated than Angry Birds or Fruit Ninja. And with regards to the kind of game Disco Elysium is, that irritation, I think, was justified. Because no matter how much you fine-tune it for mobile use and how snappy you make the dialog box, it will remain a game that demands your full attention and active thinking over prolonged time periods. Mobile gaming, on the other hand, usually lends itself to a very different niche in our attention economy. And there are limits to bridging that gap between classic stationary and mobile gaming. Tailoring Disco Elysium to short play sessions will work to the same degree that you can tailor Flappy Bird to immersive all-nighters. Neither is impossible, but the games don't exactly lend themselves to it. Now, when I played the port, I must admit that I basically played Disco Immobile. Since I wanted to publish the review somewhere around the release date, I played it for hours at a time, and I also played it at my PC desk because I needed to record the footage. But there were still moments when I was deep into an atmospheric scene and suddenly got a WhatsApp notification on my screen. That, of course, is a bummer when you're playing a game that requires a certain amount of immersion to work its magic. And that's why I can't imagine playing Disco Elysium in short intervals that don't let you build this essential immersion. A lot of its magic will be lost that way. I still remember the exact moment when I got hooked on the original game. It was 2 AM and I was talking to Joyce about the Pale when her eerie soundtrack kicked in. The visuals, the world building and the music all worked together, they were all dark and mysterious, and it's still one of the most hauntingly beautiful experiences I had with video games. But that key experience of mine would have not been possible if I instead played through that scene in 3 10-minute sessions on the subway. And without spoiling the game too much, there are certain late-game events that simply require your attention for at least half an hour. These are in-game events that I understand to be organic units that you simply can chop up into bite-sized pieces if you value the game as an art form at all. Ultimately, making Disco Elysium playable in short, easily digestible bursts is in many ways simply not possible when these exact short bursts are what makes its content indigestible. And as a last comment on the marketing pitch from before, I don't think Disco Elysium is an escapist game either. It's far too much of an uncomfortable mirror of our own reality and psyche to be an escape from it. Or in other words, escapism simply is not the ethical relation that disco has to our world, especially not in the form of a quick distraction. And ultimately, I don't think that switching the hardware that it's played on can change that. At the end of the day, the big question is how much is Disco Elysium as an experience and a work of art dependent on its form as an isometric CRPG? And to what extent does a mobile port introduce an objective contradiction between form and content? I mentioned before that the answer to this question really boils down to what you think the core of the game really is. Because for most of its parts, Disco's story, the characters, its world and politics are still all there in the mobile port. Exploration and detective work, however, not so much. As for myself, I am not sure how much RPG is really left in Disco Elysium when the only player choice is between dialogue options, even though I guess that would still be well within the technical definition of an RPG. But I always felt like the immersion of actively walking through the matinee's rain, hearing the horns and really assuming the role of Harry by maneuvering him through the city was an essential part of my own experience with Disco Elysium. But then again, if you want to play the game more like an audiobook and just go through the story, then Disco Mobile might very well be your disco of choice. By the way, if you want to play the original Disco Elysium on a mobile device, you still have the option to use a Steam Deck. I would not recommend getting it for the Switch though, because the performance is quite lackluster and full of bugs, and the Switch 2 is also only marginally better at running it. As we approach the end of the review, I want to quickly mention a more practical matter, which is the game's performance. The footage you see here was captured on the Samsung Galaxy A54, which I bought 2 years ago for $200 and I did not notice any stuttering at all. If you notice minor frame drops in the video, that's due to my recording software. For good measure, I also tried the game with a downright antique 2014 Galaxy A5 with Android 8 and it was still very much playable. I didn't encounter any serious bugs either, only a hilarious one where Lena's husband stood right behind her while she was worried sick about his whereabouts. Before I conclude the video, I want to rapid fire through a few essential facts that didn't make it into any of the previous categories. Thoughts are now internalized in real time and show up in your phone's notification bar. They probably changed this because the game doesn't have in-game time anymore. But I think it's quite funny to suddenly get a random alert about how you finished thinking about communism or being gay while you're doing something entirely different. There is no manual or quick save anymore, so save scumming before checks is gone. Instead, the game constantly creates autosaves that put you right where you left off when you restart the app. Instead of being able to create your very own character build, you are now limited to choosing between the 3 archetypes. A little sad if you ask me, because it didn't strike me as something that is particularly hard to implement. Also missing are the 4 political quests that came with the original's final cut. Which is again a shame because these quests included some of the game's best content. They did mention though that they might add it at a later point if the demand is there. And lastly, although it's not exactly new content, the game changed the encounter conditions for the mysterious pair of eyes, which in the original game was the rarest encounter and really only accessible through cheats.
I have a mysterious pair of eyes.
By now, the common sentiment is that Zaum has lost the mandate of heaven and will in all likelihood never produce another lightning in a bottle. If there ever was a goose that laid golden eggs, it's gone now, as is our chance to get Disco Elysium 2 in the foreseeable future. Instead, we got Disco Mobile. In this less than ideal situation, it's easy to interpret the port as the only thing the studio can do now, rehashing old content and capitalizing on what little remains of their declined reputation. But I think if it really was that simple, they wouldn't have gone through so much effort. Because they could have just scaled down Disco Elysium to a vertical phone screen and charged us $30 for it. Instead, at the very least, they put some actual thought into how to adapt the game to a mobile format and a new mode of playing. It's a port in which we see both the capabilities and the clear limitations of mobile gaming when it comes to RPGs. In this review, I pointed out several issues that I have with the game, especially regarding its overly streamlined gameplay, limited player agency, limited capacity for player immersion, and the derivative and generic aspects of its otherwise pretty artwork. Yet, at the same time, I don't know if I could have come up with a better way to solve the problems they were facing when it came to porting Disco Elysium to mobile devices. Would it have been better if, for example, instead of fixed chapters, we had a map with 100 fast travel points that transport us to their respective scene at any time? I'm not sure, you tell me, and by that I mean literally in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinion on the port. You can also subscribe to the channel while you're at it. But in conclusion, do I think the port is better than the original Disco Elysium? No, I think it's worse. But at the same time, it's also something very different, which is why its shortcomings are no argument against its existence. The mobile port serves a different target group and stands in no competition to the original game. If anything, it will serve as a gateway to it. To what extent it will accomplish that, I don't know. But what I do know is that I got my mom to try out Disco Mobile and that she thinks that Kim is a dashing gentleman. Her playing Disco Elysium is something that would have never happened without the port. The last video game she played was Spider Solitaire, the one pre-installed on Windows XP. So at the very least, Disco Mobile fulfills its purpose of being a low-threshold, easily accessible entry to the world of Elysium. A large portion of its player base, I assume, will be people who are simply not too familiar with gaming on consoles and PCs and who don't have the hardware for it to begin with. Now, will I still tell them to play the original game after they finish the mobile version? Absolutely, and so should you.